At 4:17 hours on September 14, 1944, Sergeant Thomas Hale of No. 4 Commando lay concealed in a shallow depression on the eastern side of a hardwood forest in northern France. His body was covered with a thin layer of wet leaves and loose soil applied during the night infiltration. Visibility in the area was reduced to roughly 20 meters due to fog held low by the dense canopy. The only ambient noise came from moisture dripping off branches and occasional movement of wind in the upper treetops. The forest floor itself was quiet. Hale carried a Sten Mk2 that most men in his unit considered unreliable. The weapon bore clear signs of field repairs: a fore-end held together with cloth binding, a slightly loose magazine housing, and internal parts taken from mismatched production batches. The stock had been replaced months earlier after blast damage. Despite its appearance and the comments it attracted, Hale preferred it because he understood exactly how it behaved at close range and how to prevent mechanical noise by holding the magazine in place. At approximately 4:17, he detected movement approaching from the northwest. The pattern suggested a German Jagd Commando, a 12-man hunting unit that had been active in the sector for 3 consecutive mornings. Hale identified 2 forward scouts by their light, deliberate steps. Behind them, he recognized the weight distribution of a machine gun team carrying an MG-42, along with a separate operator managing a radio set. The remaining soldiers were spread in a wide, line-abreast search formation routinely used by German forces in wooded terrain. This same detachment had executed 3 pre-dawn strikes between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock hours in the previous 72 hours, each resulting in Allied casualties without any confirmed losses on the German side. Their methods indicated familiarity with the terrain, predetermined firing locations, and efficient withdrawal routes. Hale remained motionless, maintaining a low-ready angle with the Sten, stabilizing the magazine to eliminate rattle. His task at this stage was observation: confirm their movement lane, verify spacing, and determine whether the enemy was repeating previous approach patterns. The German unit, unaware of his presence and believing the forest uncontested, advanced directly into his area of concealment. 12 men were entering the killing zone. None of them yet understood that this morning's engagement would be different. By the time Hale first crawled into this sector, the forest already had a reputation among the companies operating nearby. It was a layered environment, constructed by decades of unmanaged growth and the remnants of older conflicts that had shaped the terrain long before 1944. The upper canopy was composed mainly of beech and spruce, tall enough to trap early morning fog and keep the ground dim even when the sun was fully above the horizon. Beneath that sat a mid-level of younger trees and tangling undergrowth, which created numerous blind spots and made it difficult for any unit to maintain visual contact beyond a few dozen paces. The forest floor shifted unpredictably between soft, silent moss and dry leaf beds that crackled under pressure. The mixture encouraged false assumptions. A man could move without noise for 20 meters and then suddenly betray his position with a single misplaced step. Allied units had been probing this forest for weeks. Patrols reported inconsistent sound propagation, strange echoing patterns, and a general difficulty determining direction based on hearing alone. Many of the soldiers were veterans of North Africa or Italy, and although they were accustomed to tactical complexity, this terrain presented a different kind of problem. The shapes and distances inside the woods changed with light levels, turning at dawn and dusk into uncertain silhouettes. Even trained point men struggled to distinguish a tree trunk from a potentially occupied fighting position until they were too close. That margin of error had already cost lives. The Germans understood this advantage. Intelligence gathered from French civilians and intercepted documents suggested the presence of a specialized hunting detachment, likely a composite element pulled from a larger infantry regiment, reorganized specifically for countering commando activity in the region. They operated in small groups, typically 10 to 12 men, and moved with the precision of a force accustomed to working independently. Their familiarity with the forest was evident in the way they repositioned between engagements, always selecting ground that limited their exposure and maximized the chance that any advancing patrol would walk directly into their line of fire before realizing contact had begun. 3 separate incidents in the preceding 72 hours confirmed the effectiveness of their tactics. The first occurred at approximately 0435 when a British reconnaissance patrol of 6 men failed to return from a routine sweep along the forest's southern edge. A secondary search recovered no bodies, only spent 7.92 mm casings and a few bloodied scraps of webbing caught on a tree root. The absence of corpses was unusual and indicated a coordinated enemy effort to deny the Allies information about weapon types, firing angles, or even the number of shooters involved. The second incident happened the following morning. A Canadian patrol attempted to trace the route of the missing party but made the mistake of entering a low corridor where the fog pooled at just the right depth to obscure mid-range shapes. A short burst from a concealed MG-42 struck the lead pair almost immediately. A third man went down while attempting to reposition for return fire. The remaining members withdrew on instinct, but none of them were able to identify the German firing point. They reported no silhouettes, no muzzle flash, and no audible repositioning by the enemy. The Germans had struck cleanly and then vanished into the trees. On the third morning, an Allied platoon was ordered to conduct a broader sweep with additional spacing and more deliberate movement. They advanced in a dispersed formation, maintaining strict noise discipline. For the first half hour they saw nothing unusual. Then, without warning, they encountered a short sequence of detonations, likely rifle grenades or hand-thrown charges, followed by brief German shouting in what sounded like a withdrawal signal. By the time the platoon reached the area, the forest was empty again. Only shallow depressions in the soil and a few broken branches suggested that anyone had been present at all. These operations had a cumulative effect on morale. Soldiers accepted casualties as part of their work, but the manner in which these occurred, always before dawn, always without clear visibility, and always without the opportunity to return meaningful fire, created an atmosphere of quiet resignation. Men understood that entering the forest between 4 o'clock and 5 o'clock meant operating at a built-in disadvantage. They began calling it, the hour you don't want to draw the short straw for, a reference to the rotating schedule of patrol assignments. No one used the term openly in front of officers, but the sentiment was widespread. Command recognized the problem but lacked a clean solution. Sending larger forces risked creating more targets. Bringing heavier weapons into the forest was impractical due to the terrain. Night movement with illumination would only reveal Allied positions sooner than German ones. The fundamental issue was visibility. The enemy could identify Allied silhouettes before the Allies could distinguish anything at all. Hale had followed every after-action account. He had walked sections of the perimeter where survivors described hearing shots that seemed to come from multiple directions. He examined trees where bullets had struck at downward angles indicating elevated firing points. He noted the absence of typical field signs. No cigarette butts, no disturbed soil that resembled careless movement, no scent of recently fired weapons lingering in the air. Whoever these German hunters were, they performed their work with methodical discipline. Critically, Hale understood something that most of the others overlooked. The forest did not simply hide these German units. It absorbed them. The terrain favored defenders with patience and intimate knowledge of its structure. And unlike Allied forces, which rotated patrols and personnel, the German detachment likely operated with the same small group of men using the same terrain features repeatedly until their actions became instinctive. To counter that, someone had to enter the forest earlier than they did, stay lower than they expected, and think through the problem as a hunter rather than a patrolling infantryman. Hale believed he could do it, not because he was braver or more skilled, but because he had spent his entire life reading wooded ground in the low light of early morning. He knew how movement changed shape depending on angle, how sound traveled in damp air, and how to sit still long enough for the forest to reveal who belonged and who didn't. By the evening before the fourth morning, word spread quietly among the troops that Hale was planning to go in long before dawn with 2 additional men. There was no speech, no promise of eliminating the threat, no bold statement of capability. Just a simple comment he made to the platoon commander, that the enemy wasn't unbeatable, they were simply the ones entering the forest earliest and reading it best. If someone reversed that advantage, the outcome might change. His decision altered the dynamic inside the unit. Men who had joked about his unreliable Sten stopped commenting when they saw him inspecting each magazine by feel, tapping each feed lip lightly against a canteen to test rigidity. Others watched as he coated the weapon in a thin layer of oil mixed with dark soil to mute its shine. No one said it aloud, but the change in atmosphere was clear. If Hale was willing to face the German detachment on its own terms, the least they could do was respect the preparation. The forest had been eating patrols for 3 days. On the 4th, for the first time, someone planned to make the forest spit one back. Thomas Hale was not the most imposing soldier in No. 4 Commando, nor the loudest, nor the one with the highest marksmanship scores during formal training. What set him apart was something that rarely appeared on course reports or personnel files: an instinctive understanding of wooded terrain and how people behaved inside it. Before the war, Hale had worked on a private estate in Yorkshire as an assistant gamekeeper. The job required long hours alone in areas where visibility was naturally restricted, where sound carried differently at dawn and dusk, and where movement had to be planned in detail to avoid disturbing more than intended. He learned early to track without leaving clear tracks, and to observe without announcing his presence. None of this was glamorous, it was simply the work he had been raised into. When he later transferred into the commandos, these habits, quiet observation, patience, and ability to remain still for long periods, translated into useful field skills. During training, instructors noted that Hale had an unusual ability to detect changes in his surroundings even when the changes were subtle. On several occasions he identified mock ambushes before the designated contact point, simply by recognizing when natural patterns in vegetation or sound no longer matched what he expected. His marksmanship was solid but not exceptional. What impressed instructors more was his consistency. He rarely fired early and he almost never fired late. He made decisions only when he was certain. This trait became his defining characteristic in later operations. The Sten Mk2 he carried had a far less positive reputation. By 1944, the Sten series was widely known across British forces as easy to manufacture but susceptible to jamming and accidental discharge. Hale's weapon had an additional history that made it the subject of routine jokes among his peers. Months earlier, during a push through a village near Cannes, a blast from a German mortar round had damaged the stock and bent the front section of his original weapon. Replacement parts were sourced from several different depots, resulting in a hybrid build that bore no resemblance to any clean factory-issued version. The stock came from one batch, the receiver from another, and the bolt assembly was a refurbished unit that the armorer believed still carried microscopic scoring from earlier use. The fore-end had a small crack running lengthwise, which Hale stabilized with cloth wrapping and a strip of wire twisted tight with pliers. Most men in the unit viewed the weapon as unsafe. Several openly recommended that Hale trade it in for a more reliable specimen from company stores. The armorer went as far as documenting the weapon as structurally compromised, field modifications excessive, but since it still fired during basic function checks and Hale insisted on keeping it, the matter was dropped. Hale's relationship with the weapon was practical rather than emotional. He had spent enough time with it to understand how it behaved at close range, especially regarding feeding reliability. The Sten's design required firm support of the side-mounted magazine. Otherwise, rounds could misalign. Hale compensated by applying constant manual pressure on the magazine housing with his left hand, something he practiced deliberately until it became automatic. He also tested every magazine the unit acquired, discarding those that showed the slightest inconsistency in feed angle or spring tension. Out of the dozen magazines available to him, he relied on only 4. The others were marked with chalk and stored separately. The Sten's external noise profile, a common complaint, was also something Hale found ways to manage. Any loose metal component would produce audible clicking if moved too quickly. To mitigate this, Hale coated several exposed surfaces with a thin mixture of heavy oil and soil, reducing both shine and vibration. He bound a section of the receiver with fabric not for aesthetics but to deaden any accidental contact with kit buckles or equipment near his chest. These steps were neither new nor ingenious. Several commandos used similar techniques in various theaters. What distinguished Hale was how thoroughly he applied them and how precisely he understood the consequences of not doing so. In the context of the coming mission, his reasons for sticking with the weapon were straightforward. Engagement distances inside the forest rarely exceeded 20 meters, and in low visibility conditions, the ability to fire short, precise bursts outweighed the aesthetic appeal of a better-maintained submachine gun. Hale trusted the Sten not because it was well made, but because he knew exactly how it would behave under stress. Any replacement weapon would require a learning period he no longer had time for. His peers still doubted his judgment. In the days leading up to the mission, several commented, half-jokingly, that the Germans wouldn't need to fire if the Sten jammed at the wrong moment. Others suggested that the distinctive rattle of the weapon would give him away before he had a chance to fire. But as Hale prepared for the 4th morning, listening to the quiet forest, studying the patch of ground where he intended to hide, and checking each component of the Sten with practiced care, the tone of the comments around him shifted. Soldiers who had previously mocked the weapon now observed his routine with a mix of curiosity and concern. They understood that if the German hunting detachment struck again, someone had to be willing to go into the woods early and force a different outcome. Hale had chosen to be that person, and the weapon he trusted, whether anyone else respected it or not, would be the tool he carried. Throughout the evening before the mission, Hale maintained a methodical pace. He reviewed maps of the sector, cross-referenced tree lines marked by previous patrols, and compared their observations to his own reconnaissance notes. He memorized likely German approach routes based on the terrain structure, the spacing of trees, the gradient of slopes, the availability of cover, and the presence of old trench works dating back to the First World War. His familiarity with the region was not perfect, but it was enough to make informed predictions. He had already identified 2 locations where the Germans were likely to position their scouts, as well as a third point where the MG-42 team could anchor their formation if they intended to cut off a retreat. As final light faded, Hale performed one more inspection of the Sten. He drew the bolt back slightly, verified resistance, allowed it to settle quietly, then checked the seating of the magazine with the practiced upward pressure that kept the weapon stable. The routine was not ceremonial. It was simply the last confirmation that the tool he depended on would behave as expected in the dark. By the time he finished, the jokes had ceased entirely. The men understood what he intended to do, and although no one said it directly, the atmosphere shifted into the same quiet tension that precedes operations where the margin for error is thin. They were not certain that Hale's plan would work. But they also knew that without someone like him taking the initiative, the forest would continue consuming patrols one dawn at a time. When Hale finally lay down to rest for an hour before stepping off, the Sten remained next to him, wrapped in cloth and earth-darkened oil, held together by expertise and familiarity rather than quality manufacturing. It was not a remarkable weapon. It was simply the one he knew, and on the morning to come, familiarity would matter more than reputation. By the evening of September 13th, the pattern of German activity in the forest was clear enough for command to acknowledge a persistent tactical imbalance. The enemy detachment operated with consistent timing, predictable discipline, and a level of familiarity with the terrain that allowed them to initiate contact on their own terms. Their attacks always fell within the same 45-minute window before sunrise, exploiting the transitional light when silhouettes sharpened just enough to expose moving patrols but not enough for those patrols to identify the origin of incoming fire. Each engagement ended the same way, short, accurate bursts from concealed positions, followed by an organized withdrawal that left no bodies, no equipment, and no reliable traces behind. Inside the company command post, a small dugout reinforced with timber and camouflaged netting, the atmosphere was subdued. A lantern fitted with a red filter provided minimal illumination. A map lay across a crate of mortar rounds, pinned at the corners by canteens. The markings on the map showed 3 separate contact points, each approximately 400 to 500 meters apart, forming a shallow arc along the forest's interior. It was enough to confirm that the same German unit, or a unit employing the same tactics, was shaping the fights to its advantage. The platoon commander reviewed the reports without raising his voice. He noted the timing, the lack of second shots, the disappearing bodies, and the absence of any captured German shell casings except those deliberately left behind. He summarized the issue in plain terms. The Allies were not being outgunned, they were being detected first. Patrols sent into the forest during the hour before dawn were effectively operating blind while the enemy acted with full situational awareness. Sending larger forces would not correct the discrepancy. Assigning heavier weapons would slow movement and increase target size. Illumination was out of the question. Any artificial light would give away position before providing a meaningful advantage. The room remained quiet while he spoke. No one volunteered suggestions and no one attempted to speak over the tension that settled around the map. The men understood that the German hunters were succeeding not through numbers but through the consistent use of early infiltration, terrain mastery, and well-timed engagement. Hale, seated slightly apart from the others, listened without interrupting. When the commander finished outlining the problem, Hale stated his view with the same matter-of-fact tone he used when describing range conditions. He said the issue was not weaponry, not courage, and not numbers. The issue was timing. The Germans were entering the forest before the Allies, choosing firing points before the Allies reached them, and watching the terrain sharpen just enough to expose movement. If someone reversed that sequence, if an Allied element occupied key ground before the German formation arrived, the advantage might shift. The commander asked what such a plan would require. Hale answered, a 3-man team, insertion well before 0300, no lanterns, and positions selected not for firing lanes but for early detection. He explained that firing first would not be the initial objective. The goal was to determine the German approach lanes to a degree of certainty that previous patrols had not achieved. Engagement would occur only when identification was firm and when the German unit was still compressed enough for controlled action. It did not escape anyone's notice that Hale intended to bring his Sten Mk2, the same weapon others dismissed as unreliable. When questioned indirectly about it, Hale gave a simple explanation. He knew the weapon's behavior at close range, trusted its feeding when handled correctly, and valued its low mechanical signature when stabilized. A newer Sten or a captured MP-40 would require adjustments he did not want to make under time pressure. The commander did not challenge the point further. He asked who Hale wanted with him. Hale requested Corporal Briggs, a measured rifleman who could operate independently at moderate distance, and Private Larkin, a younger soldier with steady nerves who had demonstrated competence with grenades and short-range interdiction. The trio provided a balance of observation, precision, and area denial suited to the forest environment. The plan was finalized within minutes. Hale would lead the team into the forest before 0230, taking a route that avoided known patrol paths and offered predictable cover for withdrawal if required. Briggs would position himself along a narrow game trail that intersected one probable German approach axis. Larkin would secure the withdrawal corridor, positioned near a shallow defile where any retreating enemy would likely pass. Hale himself would move deeper, selecting a concealment point where he could monitor both the scouts and the central element of the German formation. The commander issued one final instruction: no firing unless identification was certain, no heroic maneuvering, and no unnecessary pursuit. The goal was to stop the loss of patrols, not to stage a dramatic engagement. The risks were acknowledged plainly. If the Germans advanced earlier than expected, if they deviated from their usual approach, or if Hale's team was detected during infiltration, the outcome could resemble the last 3 mornings. But the alternative, allowing the forest to continue consuming patrols without contest, was no longer acceptable. Hale's plan was the only actionable option available, and it depended on entering the terrain earlier, moving quieter, and seeing first. By the time the meeting ended, the mood inside the dugout had changed. No one claimed the plan would work, yet for the first time in days the company had something resembling an initiative. Hale left the post without ceremony, carrying the patched Sten across his chest and the 4 magazines he trusted clipped inside his webbing. There were no jokes as he passed through the rows of resting men. Even those who doubted his weapon understood the significance of what he intended to do. At 2:30 hours he would step into the forest ahead of a German unit that had controlled the dawn for 3 consecutive days, and if his assessment was correct, the next dawn would not belong to them. Hale began his preparations immediately after leaving the command post. His approach was systematic and free of unnecessary movement. He first reviewed the latest patrol sketches, confirming which trails had produced noise complaints and which had remained quiet under controlled movement. He focused primarily on ground composition, soil type, moisture levels, and the density of surface debris, because these factors determine not just mobility but also the likelihood of producing detectable noise under load. A few of the recent incidents had occurred along stretches where dry leaf litter collected in shallow pockets, and he knew to avoid these areas entirely during infiltration. Before final light disappeared, Hale conducted a brief walk along the perimeter to verify that his predicted German approach routes remained unchanged. He noted how the fog settled into certain depressions and avoided others, confirming where low visibility would be both consistent and tactically relevant. He registered the locations of several older trenches, relics of earlier fighting, now partially collapsed but still deep enough to function as concealed movement channels. These features were not marked on most Allied maps but were recognizable to anyone who took the time to study the ground closely. Returning to his kit, Hale performed a full inspection of his Sten. He removed the bolt group, checked the spring tension, and ensured that the feed path was unobstructed. Each of his 4 selected magazines was tested by hand. A quick thumb pressure on the top round, a slight tap against his palm, and a final check of the feed angle. He inserted the magazine he trusted most but kept the remaining 3 isolated in separate pouches to prevent accidental damage. Once satisfied with mechanical readiness, he applied a fresh layer of darkened oil to the exposed metal surfaces and wiped away the excess until the weapon had a dull, non-reflective finish. Briggs and Larkin arrived shortly after, carrying light loads to maximize mobility. Hale briefed them concisely. Briggs would position himself near the convergence of 2 game trails, giving him the opportunity to observe the northern arc where the German scouts were most likely to appear. Larkin would secure the eastern edge of the operation, near a narrow gully that provided both cover and a likely fallback route if the situation deteriorated. Communication between the 3 would be minimal. Movements and engagement decisions would rely on prearranged timing and situational awareness rather than radio traffic. Any unnecessary signal transmission risked detection by the German radio operator. By 2 o'clock hours the team was ready. They checked their watches, synchronized time, and reviewed the infiltration sequence one final time. The fog was denser now, lowering visibility to 10 meters in some areas. This was beneficial during the approach but would complicate observation later. Hale accounted for this by planning to select a position where the fog was thinner and the overhead canopy looser, ensuring he had a clear view of the movement corridor without exposing himself. At 2:30 hours, the three men departed the perimeter. They moved without speaking, adjusting their pace to match terrain conditions. Every step was deliberate. Hale led, guiding them along a narrow route he had mapped out the previous evening. The ground here was soft, packed with moisture but not saturated enough to produce suction noises. Fallen branches were either avoided entirely or stepped on at points near the trunk where the wood was thickest and least likely to crack. After 20 minutes, the team reached the point where their paths would diverge. Briggs moved off first, disappearing behind a cluster of beech trees with his rifle held low. Larkin followed a minute later, heading toward the gully where he would prepare his position. Hale continued deeper into the forest alone, selecting a large, partially uprooted tree as his concealment point. The soil beneath it formed a natural depression, deep enough for him to lie prone with only the top of his helmet visible through the leaf cover. He spread a thin layer of wet leaves across his back and arms to break up any remaining shape definition. At 3:30 hours, all three men were in position. The fog remained steady. The forest was quiet. Hale listened for patterns, dripping moisture, shifting branches, the distant movement of air, until he could distinguish each recurring sound from anything that might indicate human presence. He adjusted his grip on the Sten, applied slight upward pressure on the magazine to lock it in place and waited. By entering the forest 90 minutes before the expected German arrival, the team had achieved the first objective of the plan. They were now in position before the enemy, occupying terrain the Germans assumed would be empty. Whether this advantage would translate into a successful engagement remained uncertain, but for the first time in several days, the conditions favored observation rather than reaction. The forest had taken 3 Allied patrols without warning. Now, for the first time, someone was already inside when the enemy came searching. Between 3:45 and 4 o'clock hours, the forest retained its earlier stillness, but Hale recognized gradual changes that indicated the enemy was approaching. The fog had begun to shift in inconsistent patterns, thinning in one direction and thickening in another. These changes were subtle and would have gone unnoticed by someone without extensive experience in wooded terrain, but to Hale they were early warnings. Air displacement caused by human movement differed from natural wind. It altered the fog in linear shapes rather than broad, diffused movement. He monitored these patterns carefully, narrowing down the likely entry point of the German formation. At approximately 0402 hours, Hale detected the first verifiable sign of enemy presence. It came in the form of a brief, muted disturbance, 2 consecutive compressions in the leaf litter roughly 40 meters to his northwest. The spacing and cadence matched the step pattern of a forward scout, one man moving slowly, then pausing, then shifting weight again to test the ground ahead. This was consistent with the movement style used by German reconnaissance-trained infantry in wooded terrain. 2 minutes later, a second set of steps followed, offset by several meters and with a slightly heavier footfall, indicating a support scout or the second man in the lead pair. Hale remained still. His body was positioned at a shallow angle relative to the expected German movement corridor, allowing him to observe their approach without needing to turn his head. Any unnecessary movement risked detection, especially at close range. The Sten remained angled low, with Hale maintaining magazine pressure to prevent any mechanical noise. He listened for additional indicators. When German troops moved in formation, each sector tended to follow a predictable rhythm. Scouts first, then the main body in a staggered line, with heavier equipment carriers positioned centrally. By 4:06 hours, the main body had entered the engagement zone. Hale identified at least 3 distinct sound signatures. The first was a heavier, slower series of steps accompanied by faint metallic contact. The spacing suggested 2 men sharing equipment weight, consistent with a machine gun team carrying an MG-42, tripod components or ammunition belts. This matched past reports indicating the German hunters relied on short, precise bursts rather than sustained fire. The second signature was a steady, slightly uneven footfall associated with the radio operator. The weight distribution of a backpack radio created a detectable shift, slight forward lean followed by a compensating backward step. Hale had heard this pattern before on multiple patrols and recognized it immediately. The remaining soldiers formed a loose perimeter as they advanced. Hale could not see them, but their movement was identifiable through small disturbances. Twigs flexing under limited weight, soil compressed only briefly before the step was released, and the occasional adjustment of sling-mounted rifles. The formation aligned with known German practice when sweeping forest terrain. Wide spacing, each man responsible for a specific angle of observation, with the central core remaining ready to anchor the unit if contact occurred. The Germans were unaware that an Allied team was already inside their search area. Their movement suggested they believed they were once again engaging in empty forest until Allied patrols emerged later in the hour. This assumption had served them well for 3 days, and nothing in the terrain offered any visual sign to contradict it. At 4:10 hours, the lead scout entered Hale's immediate vicinity. The scout paused within 15 meters of Hale's position. Hale could see only the lower portion of the man's trousers and boots through the foliage. The scout crouched briefly, touched the ground with his hand, and examined leaf displacement. He was checking for recent passage, a common practice among German units trained to counter infiltration. Hale's concealment was sufficient. He had entered before midnight, long before any dew patterns had formed. Nothing in the soil indicated fresh disturbance. After a several-second assessment, the scout rose and signaled weakly with 2 fingers, most likely indicating the area was clear. Hale let the scout pass. This was part of the plan. Any premature engagement risked alerting the entire German formation before it reached the depth required for controlled action. Hale monitored the scout's departure, noting the direction and pace. A second scout followed, repeating many of the same movements but with slightly less caution, indicating confidence based on the first scout's assessment. By now Briggs and Larkin would have detected movement in their respective sectors as well. Briggs, positioned along a game trail, would be hearing synchronized footsteps from the German right flank. Larkin, observing the fallback route, would be tracking how the Germans spread outward as they passed deeper into the forest. Their roles were not to engage immediately but to confirm the shape of the enemy formation and be ready to intercept or contain movement if the Germans attempted to withdraw after contact. At 4:13 hours, the center of the German formation reached an area approximately 20 meters from Hale's position. The MG-42 team paused briefly, likely evaluating potential firing angles or adjusting their pace to stay aligned with the scouts. The radio operator stopped as well, adjusting the straps on his set. These brief halts gave Hale the final confirmation he needed. The Germans were following one of the predicted approach corridors almost exactly, and they had committed themselves deep enough into the terrain that disengaging quickly would be difficult. The forest itself remained quiet, offering no clues that the situation differed from the previous 3 mornings. The Germans proceeded cautiously but confidently, unaware that an Allied element was lying in wait, positioned earlier than they expected and prepared to act only when the formation reached its most vulnerable point. At 4:17 hours, the German detachment was fully inside the engagement zone. The window for observation was closing. The window for action was approaching. Hale tightened his grip on the Sten, maintaining pressure on the magazine, and mentally confirmed the next step of the plan. For the first time in several days, the German hunters were not alone in the forest before dawn. By 4:18 hours, the German detachment had advanced far enough into the interior that their formation began to compress naturally. The scouts had moved ahead, the machine gun team maintained a steady center position, and the remainder of the unit adjusted spacing to compensate for reduced visibility. This tightening of intervals was predictable in forested terrain. Once inside densely packed tree lines, the Germans were forced to navigate around obstacles that narrowed their approach lanes. Hale had anticipated this. A compressed formation reduced their ability to maneuver quickly and limited their capacity to identify threats from multiple angles. The first opportunity to strike came sooner than expected. At 4:20, the second forward scout drifted slightly off his intended path, stepping into the shallow depression where Hale's cover blended into the surrounding leaves. The scout paused for less than a second, long enough for Hale to determine that the man had no suspicion of danger but too close for the situation to be ignored. Hale waited for the scout to resume movement and then, once the man's back was angled away, applied a short, controlled burst to the upper torso. The distance was less than 5 meters. The Sten performed as expected, cycling cleanly. The scout dropped immediately, his body settling into the leaf bed without producing any noise that could travel far. The first scout, positioned ahead of the fallen man, turned instinctively toward the sound but lacked a clear reference point in the fog. Hale fired a second short burst. Both scouts were now down, and the opening phase of the engagement had begun. Within moments, the German formation reacted. Movement signals passed down the line. Several soldiers shifted into flanking positions, a standard response to unexpected fire, and the MG-42 team attempted to orient toward the perceived threat area. Their inability to see through the fog forced them to rely on sound alone. Hale's suppressed mechanical profile gave them nothing reliable to work with. They hesitated, rechecked their angles and repositioned by a few meters, but their formation lacked a fixed point of contact to anchor their maneuver. At the same time, Briggs, observing from his elevated position along the game trail, confirmed movement on the German right. Through the limited visibility, he could distinguish 3 silhouettes adjusting their positions in response to the initial contact. He waited for a clear shot. At 4:22, one of the Germans stepped into a narrow break in the trees, providing the necessary identification. Briggs fired a single, centered rifle round. The target dropped. The remaining troops near him froze briefly, unsure whether the shot had come from the same angle as the earlier burst or from a separate threat. Larkin, positioned near the eastern fallback route, noted increased motion in the background, small adjustments by the German formation indicating they were evaluating potential escape paths. This was consistent with their pattern from the previous days, though in those engagements they had held the advantage and executed planned withdrawal routes. Today they lacked information. They did not know the number of attackers, their positions, or whether they were already surrounded. Larkin held his position, ready to block any movement toward the gully. The MG-42 team attempted to deploy at 4:23. Their plan was clear: suppress the suspected threat area and stabilize the formation long enough for the remaining troops to identify and counterattack. However, the conditions were no longer favorable. Fog limited visibility to less than 15 meters. The fallen scouts had not produced identifiable indicators of direction. And Hale's shots had come from a position offset from the area the scouts had searched moments earlier. As the MG-42 gunner shifted his weight to set the bipod, Hale detected the movement. The gunner's silhouette briefly broke the fog line. Hale repositioned slightly, ensuring he maintained cover while aligning on the gunner's upper torso. He fired a third controlled burst. The gunner collapsed before establishing the weapon. The assistant attempted to drag the MG-42 into a firing position but exposed himself in the process. Hale corrected his angle and fired again, eliminating the second member of the team. With the machine gun neutralized, the German formation lost its primary asset for restoring control. Communication faltered. Without a functioning radio operator, who still remained in the rear of the formation, the squad leader was forced to rely on hand signals and shouted instructions in low tones, which were difficult to interpret across the fog-restricted distances. At 4:25, Hale detected movement to his left. 2 German soldiers were attempting a cautious flank maneuver, moving from tree to tree in short, disciplined bursts. Their movement was predictable, driven by terrain constraints. Each time they shifted positions, they exposed themselves briefly while transitioning between cover points. Hale waited until the second man reached such a transition. He fired a short burst, dropping the target instantly. The first man froze, crouching behind a tree. Briggs, who had been monitoring the right flank, shifted his attention slightly to cover Hale's left. When the German soldier attempted to relocate, Briggs fired another accurate round, ending the attempt. By this stage, the remaining members of the German patrol were divided. Some stayed near the center, uncertain of the threat direction. Others, closer to Larkin's sector, began to consider withdrawal. Larkin noted one soldier attempting to move along the gully edge. He allowed the man to approach deeper into the route before engaging with a single, deliberate shot. His position, well concealed behind a root system, kept him hidden from the man's companions, preventing any immediate retaliation. Hale monitored the center of the formation. With the MG-42 gone and casualties mounting, the German leader attempted to pull his remaining men into a tighter grouping. This maneuver always carried inherent risks in forested terrain. Condensing a formation to re-establish command control often meant exposing individuals in the gaps between trees. At 0428, one German soldier stepped into such a gap. Hale fired again, maintaining burst discipline. The remaining troops hesitated, searching for any visible cue that might indicate enemy position. Fog prevented them from identifying even broad shapes. The final phase of the engagement unfolded rapidly. The surviving Germans attempted to break contact and move toward the higher ground at the southeastern edge of the engagement zone. Hale anticipated the movement. It matched the pattern predicted in his earlier analysis of terrain features. As 2 soldiers shifted toward the small rise, Hale adjusted his aim and engaged the first man. The second turned to look for cover, exposing a full side profile. Briggs, observing from above, fired once, neutralizing the target. Larkin confirmed no movement along the fallback corridor. By 0431 hours, active resistance had ceased. All 12 members of the German detachment were down, none having managed to establish sustained fire or relay communication through their radio operator. Hale remained in a low posture, scanning for any sign of movement. Briggs and Larkin continued to monitor their sectors without speaking. The forest, which had been the site of 3 consecutive German-initiated engagements, was silent again, this time under different circumstances. The enemy detachment had been neutralized before dawn, not by a larger force or heavy weapons, but by a small team positioned earlier, moving quieter and acting with deliberate, controlled precision. For the first time in days, the German hunters had not dictated the terms of the engagement. By 4:33 hours, the immediate engagement was complete, but the operation itself was not considered finished. Hale, Briggs, and Larkin remained in their positions for several minutes, adhering to standard counter-ambush protocol. Germans operating in forested terrain occasionally used wounded personnel or staged silence to lure advancing forces into secondary kill zones. Hale monitored every section of the engagement area, watching for irregular fog movement, residual noise, or any sign of coordinated repositioning. None occurred. The bodies lay where they had fallen, undisturbed, and no secondary elements approached from the flanks. At 4:38, Hale gave the first verbal update through the short-range set issued for the mission. The message was brief: enemy detachment neutralized. No effective return fire. Area remains quiet. The transmission was sent only once. Excessive communication risked interference or interception, and the company command post was already listening for confirmation. Briggs regrouped with Hale first, arriving from the western game trail. He reported no additional sightings and confirmed that the right flank remained uncontested throughout the engagement. Larkin joined a minute later, maintaining his vigilance until he was certain no German forces had attempted to move through the gully during or after contact. With all 3 men unified, Hale instructed them to conduct a controlled sweep of the immediate area, prioritizing verification rather than collection. The sweep followed a structured pattern. Hale advanced along the path taken by the German scouts, checking each fallen soldier for signs of continued breathing or concealed weapons. Briggs covered broader angles, ensuring no soldier had attempted to crawl into deeper cover. Larkin examined the machine gun position and the radio operator's final location. All 12 German personnel were accounted for. The radio set, damaged by stray fire or impact, was non-functional. The MG-42 remained unloaded. The gunner had been struck before completing his setup. Most of the German rifles had full magazines, reinforcing that the unit had not successfully identified or engaged Hale's team. By 5 o'clock hours, the fog had begun to recede, and the first measurable daylight reached the forest floor. This shift improved visibility enough for the unit commander and a small escort to move into the area. When they arrived, the commander conducted his own inspection without commentary. He observed the bodies, noted their distribution, and reviewed the positions chosen by Hale, Briggs, and Larkin. From his perspective, the engagement had achieved its objective with minimal risk to friendly forces. But the outcome also revealed information that the previous 3 engagements had concealed. The German detachment depended heavily on securing height, visibility, and initiative. Once denied those advantages, their tactical effectiveness diminished sharply. As the commander completed his circuit, several soldiers from the perimeter began arriving in small groups. They were not part of the formal assessment team, but word of a successful pre-dawn counteraction had spread quickly. Some of them had participated in earlier patrols that encountered the German detachment and were familiar with the psychological effect of their repeated pre-dawn engagements. The reaction now was a mixture of relief and surprise. The patrol that had dominated the morning hours for 3 consecutive days had been neutralized in less than 10 minutes. Attention gradually shifted to Hale's weapon. The Sten Mk2 he carried was caked in mud and coated with a darkened oil mixture, its cloth bindings soaked and loosened from moisture. Several soldiers approached to examine it, not out of admiration but out of practical curiosity. Many had doubted that the weapon could fire more than a few rounds without malfunctioning. Yet Hale had fired multiple controlled bursts without a single stoppage. The armorer, having been notified of the successful mission, arrived shortly afterward and took particular interest in the weapon. He examined the feed lips of the magazine, the condition of the receiver, and the alignment of the bolt assembly. Despite his earlier reservations about the Sten's reliability, he acknowledged that Hale had managed to stabilize and maintain it beyond the expectations of its design. When asked directly why he continued using a weapon others considered unsafe, Hale responded with characteristic economy. He trusted it because he understood it. Any weapon, he explained, required familiarity, especially in low-visibility terrain. Subtle differences in mechanical behavior could determine whether a shot broke cleanly or produced a misfeed. A replacement weapon might have looked more serviceable but would not necessarily have been more reliable in the specific conditions of early morning forest combat. The official report drafted later that day reflected none of these details. It recorded the event as a successful pre-dawn counter-ambush operation resulting in 12 enemy killed and 0 friendly casualties. The narrative highlighted the importance of early infiltration and terrain familiarity but did not mention Hale's weapon, the field modifications he applied, or the degree of planning required to reverse the tactical disadvantage of prior days. Reports of this type were intended for operational summaries, not individual recognition. Nevertheless, within the company the impact was clear. The forest that had caused so much uncertainty over the past 72 hours was now approachable without the expectation of near-certain contact before dawn. Patrol schedules resumed with a level of confidence that had been absent since the first German attack. Soldiers who had previously joked about Hale's scrap metal Sten now began asking practical questions. How to stabilize their own weapons against mechanical noise, how to select magazines more effectively, and how to approach wooded terrain with the same emphasis on patience and timing. By 5:30, the operation was formally closed. The bodies of the German detachment were collected for intelligence review. Photographs and sketches were taken of their equipment and formation layout. The machine gun position and radio set were examined for evidence of larger operational patterns. Once complete, the company withdrew from the area, leaving the forest behind as daylight strengthened. In the larger context of the campaign, the event registered only as a minor action. On paper, it appeared to be a routine elimination of an enemy patrol. But among those who had operated in the forest that week, the action represented a shift in momentum. For 3 days the Germans had controlled the dawn. On the 4th, a small, quietly executed plan had reversed the outcome. Hale did not comment on the significance. He cleaned his weapon, repacked his gear, and returned to standard duties without altering his routine. The Sten, once dismissed as unreliable, remained his primary weapon. The forest, once considered a hazard, was now simply another piece of ground to be navigated with caution and preparation. The engagement did not change the course of the war. But it changed the next dawn for the men who had to walk into it.